Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our show. We have a wonderful guest. We have Ruth Wasserman Lande, a former member in Israeli Knesset, someone who worked with you in Paris, someone who's very known to have amazing accomplishments in international relations and also presenting Israel to the world. Someone who believes is in activism and has presented Israel in a very positive light. Seeing the world now has a rise of anti-Semitism and blaming Jews for many things, I invited her to the show so she could tell the audience what Israel's all about and why people should have a perception of Israel that is not usually presented in the media. So thank you so much for coming to our show.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. What time now is it in Israel right now?
Well, it's about noon. Today, actually, we're having the swearing in of the new government. So it's a special day in Israel.
I see it's a historical moment. After 12 years, a new government is coming in and a new dimension. What do you think about this new government and how will it reflect, and does it reflect a new Israeli mentality in society?
So, of course, there's a very big difference because in the last 12 years, there've been a relatively homogeneous government, the prime minister, of course, being Benjamin Netanyahu. Currently, the government, after being sworn in, will be a collection of parties. The prime minister initially for the first 2 years will be Naftali Bennett, who is from the Yamina party, a relatively right-wing, even more right-wing than the Likud, which was ousted right now. And after 2 years, it will be, according to the agreement, Yair Lapid, who is, I would say, more central, teeny bit, perhaps, to the left. But there are other parties in this coalition, like my party, Blue and White, like Tikva Hadasha, New Hope, headed the first one, Blue and White, by current Minister of Defense, Benny Gantz, the New Hope headed by Gideon Sa'ar. There's also the Ra'am party, headed by the Islamist Mansour Abbas, which was quite an astounding new thing in Israeli politics and showing how diverse the Israeli society really is. And of course, Meretz and Labour Party on the left. So it's a myriad of different parties coming together. And that certainly is a very different government than the one which was mainly Likud and the ultra-religious parties formerly.
Now, we know in history in the past that Israel has had Arab parties within the government. We have the parties back in 1951, and then later on when Yitzhak Rabin, so forth. But what makes it unique having Islamist party, Mansour Abbas, in this government? Is it different? Is it radical? Can people ask questions? Can they be trusted? What is the unique part of it about this particular event in the historical political makeup of Israel now?
So the involvement of the Ra'am party, being the Islamist party, within the actual government, heading certain committees in the Knesset, in the legislative body, is definitely unique. It has not been done before. There was an agreement in theory during the Rabin period when he was the prime minister, even involvement, but not to the point that there is today. In fact, if I may use a term from our own Judaism, he sort of, in a sense, was kashered to make him kosher to be within the government by Benjamin Netanyahu himself, bringing him in and negotiating with him to join the right-wing coalition, which he himself tried to create, not succeeding, and therefore making the other parties more able to, in terms of public relations, to approach the head of the Islamist party, who has shown tremendous pragmatism, I must say, even more so than the other Arab parties united in the Arab United List, which have shown far less pragmatism than the Islamist party. And in fact, the Islamist party is thus an actual part of the government, which is definitely unique. And we shall see what happens from now on.
Now, being a member of the Blue and White Party that's led by Gantz, and Gantz being a former IDF general, being the Ramatkal, the chief of staff. Now, does he himself, and or have you discussed with him the possibility of a security risk, being an Islamist party that maybe, as you said, being very pragmatic, that maybe they're just using this as a stepping stone to create an internal jihad? Because I spoke to Professor Mordechai Keder, and he told me that the idea is basically there's always a jihad in every type of way in the Middle East. We cannot underestimate the idea of what is jihad. And jihad basically means to overcome, to struggle. And there's political, there's economic, there is the social. Is this a possibility, your experience and your knowledge and expertise, that this could be another way of subverting the government?
Well, look, there are those who mistrust the Arab element within the Israeli government. It would be not only difficult, but relatively impossible in this makeup of a coalition government with so many parties and so many checks and balances in the legislative, judicial, and executive arms to be able to do anything, quite honestly, that would not have a million more voices on top to check and balance anything out of place, that I don't share this specific concern. To tell you that the Islamic movement originating, of course, in Egypt in the 1920s, in the Muslim Brotherhood is a kosher one? No. Is it exactly the same as what we see now, headed by Mansour Abbas? In my humble opinion and analysis, no. I think that the main objective of Mansour Abbas and his current list is to bring specific civilian and economic benefits to the Arab-Israeli minority in Israel, depending on whom you ask, between 18 and 22% of the population. I think as a staunch Zionist and somebody who made Aliyah at the age of 17, served in the military, serves still in the reserve duty in Israel, and having lived in Lod, which is a significantly complex Arab Jewish city near the airport that have recently undergone a lot of strife between Arabs and Jews, and particularly from the Arab side, a lot of violence towards the Jewish inhabitants. Again, as a Zionist mainly, I think that improving the civilian lives, the infrastructure, the job opportunity for the majority of the Arab population within Israel is a Zionistic objective. Their inclusion into society, education to be more inclusive, understanding, and accepting of the Israeli mainstream society is significantly important to the makeup and the cohesion, the strength of the Israeli society in the future. So I say that this is important, and the inclusion of this party is important not only politically, because otherwise no coalition would have been formed, but also to create a better, stronger Israeli society, because these 22% of the population are simply not going anywhere. Whether we like it, we don't like it, we are comfortable with it, or we are not. So I think that the right thing to do is to work on the inclusion of each and every citizen within the country.
My family, our family came to Israel in the 1870s, and we, in fact, my father and his family and so forth had a big involvement to do in 48. My father was, if you go to the Palmach Museum, you'll see articles of my father. My father's was the leader of the 22 who captured Hatzion on Zion and saved 1,700 Jewish men and children of Hatzion in the May 18th, 19th, and 48. So being a son of Palmachnik, being a sort of person who was very much involved in Israeli history and so forth, you had an opportunity to be an advisor to Shimon Peres. If you can tell the audience who was Shimon Peres and why was he unique and what was the relationship you had in terms of being an advisor, especially at such a young age.
It was really an honor for me to be an advisor for the former president, Shimon Peres, who was one of the founding fathers really of this country, country which I love so much. He was a very young man when he joined Ben-Gurion, the founding father and first prime minister of the state of Israel, and was already in the capacity of the Minister of Defense and actually the Director General of the Ministry of Defense at a tremendously young age. At the end of his political career, so when he was no longer a politician, but rather the president of the state of Israel, had the honor of being called from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs after having served for 3 years in Cairo in the embassy and having studied at the Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, to come and really be his advisor, learn from him. It's kind of strange to speak about advising Shimon Peres on diaspora affairs and international issues. I'm not sure that I did not learn more from him than he from me in terms of advice, but I did have the honor of working with him, consulting with him, writing for him, accepting heads of state from all over the world in the presidency in Israel, and really having this chapter, this honorable chapter, both in my resume and in my heart, having been able to work with this very special man.
What did you think you learned from him, from his thinking? What was originality, was perspectives, creativity, his ability to understand people's point of view? What was the thing that really touched you most politically?
I think, not politically, but I think the biggest lesson that I learned from him and that I took from him is that absolutely, but absolutely nothing is impossible. He would go to sleep at 11 o'clock. He was a workaholic, so am I. It's so in that sense, we sort of, we fitted, but his whole team worked really hard. And he wanted his ideas, which were told to us at 11 p.m., to be already executed at 5 a.m. And he couldn't understand why on God's earth they weren't, if they weren't. So he was very, very full of ideas, full of energy, full of belief that really everything is possible. And he used to say that, the one who doesn't believe in miracles is unrealistic. So that's him. That's what I take with me from former president of the state of Israel, Shimon Peres.
Did he ever speak to you about the founding fathers, about working with Ben-Gurion or Moshe Dayan or Eshkol or any of them?
No, but Peres wrote many books, and in his books, of course, translated into many languages, including English, one can read and get a beautiful impression of his angle of many of the founding fathers. He particularly adored and admired Ben-Gurion, who was his mentor, so to speak, and who really raised him in a sense, not from childhood, of course, but in the professional realm.
There's no question about Ben-Gurion is one of the greatest leaders in Jewish history, an amazing mind when it came to political strategies, understanding what the future would be, understanding what World War II would bring about for the Jewish nation, and just preparing a modern state based on prophetic concepts of the prophets and morals and ethics. But that being the case, moral and ethics, people always ask a question. So that question about Israel becoming a light unto nations, we've heard so many anti-Semitic reports and so many anti-Semitic media things in the media, BDS and so forth, the boycott, divest, sanction movement, where it paints Israel as an apartheid. How can we tell the audience, and how can you, being in Israel and so forth, prove to the audience that Israel is not this apartheid state, that all this is basically lies, and that Israel really is a light unto the nations? And even, as Ben-Gurion said, we're still getting there, and we're always going to get there because that is the goal of the Jewish people.
So first of all, I think that there are many people who whose hatred sort of makes their, clouds their judgment. And one needs to understand whom we are talking to. If the audience is clouded by hatred, I would imagine that it would be very difficult to convince otherwise. However, the vast majority of the audiences, particularly the United States, are simply unknowledgeable. They don't know whether Israel is an apartheid state, as you say, or a beautiful entity that is really helpful and so on. They just do not know. And they particularly lean on the messaging from the media, the social media and the general media. Social media and general media tend to be very superficial, very short, and therefore not easy to message a little bit more complex messages, especially if the messenger is telling the truth. So to put a false image and to have hundreds of thousands of people say it again and again and send it to another hundreds of thousands of people is something which is relatively easy and very, very difficult to manage. So first of all, we need to breathe and understand that this is not an easy task. It's a challenge. But as Peres had himself said, you know, an optimist would see an opportunity in every challenge rather than a challenge in every opportunity. So let's try and go via his path and really see what it is that can be done. And what it is that can be done is the following. Look, 4,500 rockets being thrown into civilian population concentrations is simply not a normal, peaceful act. So if you're talking to a crowd, let's say in Massachusetts, one could simply ask, would you not expect your government to do something for your and your family's protection if an enemy would throw 4,500 rockets into Massachusetts? Meaning that you would have no restaurants open, you would have to sit in the bunkers and hear the siren, and very advisable to actually have these people hear a siren because it is a panic attack. Now have a few of those a day, you have half the population in post-trauma, especially the children on the border of Israel. Now, they live in kibbutzim, they live in moshavim, siren, 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 security room, they go in 15 seconds to save one's life. Sometimes their homes get destroyed. The Israeli government also puts a lot of money and effort and technology into trying to protect its own civilian population, thereby investing a lot of money in the Iron Dome, making it absolutely illegal to build a house in Israel without having a proper security room, which is very expensive. In other words, there are precautions that are taken by the Israeli government that cost a lot of money and energy to protect its own civilians. On the contrary, Hamas is using its own civilians as shields. In fact, it's been proved again and again and again that the rockets are being fired from schools. Even UNRWA, the organization which is mainly Palestinian in the United Nations, taking care of the Palestinians in Gaza, has said that a lot of the tunnels were built under schools. These tunnels are not peaceful tunnels. Their aim is to attack Israeli kibbutzim, civilian populations. Kibbutzim don't have soldiers living in them. They have people, women, children, the elderly, and so on. So whereas Israel actually sanctifies life, the Hamas, on the contrary, uses civilian life in order to forward its own relatively harsh objectives. Now, those objectives are not there to be interpreted by Ruth, late Shimon Peres, rabbi, or priest. One only needs to take a look at their own charter, black and white. There's nothing to interpret. They make their mission statement clear. I invite you to take a look. It's written, we want the destruction of the state of Israel. Full stop. So if one wants your destruction, would you not expect your government to protect your own children, your own mother and father if they're elderly, if 4,500 rockets are thrown into a civilian population concentration? So the argument is not a hard one to make. It's just enveloped in a lot of lies and PR tricks that are being manipulated by people who have an interest and then duplicated by lots and lots and lots of people that are themselves being manipulated and they don't know the facts. Lastly, I would invite all of you to invite somebody who doesn't believe for a few days to live with a family on the border of Gaza, on the Israeli side, a regular family, a normative family in one of the kibbutzim or the moshavim, just for 2 or 3 days during rocket attacks. I think that should be enough to make whoever doesn't understand. By the way, I would like to add one more thing. The population, the civilian population in Gaza is experiencing a terrible, terrible tragedy. They have no running water, they don't have electricity, they have no job opportunities, and the Hamas is using them as hostages to promote their own political ends. This is a tragedy. We, as the Jewish people, we're not happy. This is not something that makes us happy. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. The money that Israel facilitated and was transferred by Qatar to the Hamas in cash for the last several years was not used for the benefit and the welfare of these poor people by the Hamas. It was used to build more tunnels. That's why there is no running water. There's no electricity. That half of the young people in the Gaza Strip are actually on drugs because they see no hope. Not because Israel is imprisoning the entire Gaza Strip. It is, by the way, because otherwise suicide bombers would go into Israel and bombard themselves, sent by Hamas. But I'd just like to remind those who are listening that we are not the only common border with Gaza. Egypt has one too. And if anybody has forgotten, Egypt too does not open its border to Hamas and to the Gazan population. Why? And more so, why is nobody asking why? Because it's all about Israel.
Years ago, I wrote a thesis comparing Israeli media in terms and also Israeli PR from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and later on. I noticed that the early Zionist masters, in terms of Ben Gurion, Eshkol, and Peres, were masters of PR presentation of Israel to the world, especially Avi Even and so forth. Later on in the 1970s and 80s, Israel became less and less in terms of being a power in terms of using the media. Unfortunately, because of that reason, also the 1982 Lebanon War, and later on the whole mess up with in terms of media, NBC, CBS, and in America, there was a big disconnect between American Jewry and Israeli Jewry. Question is, why doesn't the Israeli government itself, they may have some branches, but they don't see PR as basically a tool, as the founding fathers did. They leave it to small groups or to independent groups, but really they should do. I myself made a app called Fight BDS, and also Media Mythbusters that was sponsored by Roseanne Barr. But why doesn't the Israeli government understand that concept of that they have to make an effort? The same way they have the war effort in terms of military, they should also make a PR effort that they haven't done in many, many years.
First, I cannot agree with you. Remind you that in the last 2.5 years, we had 5, actually we had 4 elections, and there was a chance that we'd have the 5th one very soon, and that's why we're having the swearing in of this government after many, many trials that we've gone through. that's not very, let's say, conducive to being able to deal with a lot of issues. One of them, of course, is the Hasbara issue or the PR issue. Second of all, I think in the 70s, there wasn't the issue of social media. There are, after all, 1 billion Muslims and rather fewer Jewish people and people who support Israel. So it's also a matter of numbers, of duplicating a message, which is a very simplified, sometimes even just a picture being sent again and again and again and again, and doing what many words cannot do. So there are inherent difficulties. That doesn't mean that a huge concerted effort does not need to be done. I'm totally with you on that. All I can say, Rabbi Avi, that I extend my hand and offer the possibility for us to do something together.
Wonderful.
Social entrepreneurship is a wonderful thing.
Thank you. I know you're busy now and you have to go to a meeting. One last question to ask you. If you can tell the audience, because sometimes the audience thinks that the Arab population or the Druze population, the non-Jewish population, may not have the same equal rights, the same benefits. And if you can dispel that misnomer, just the opposite, that the non-Jewish citizens in Israel have the same opportunities as the Jewish citizens.
So first of all, for those who don't know, Israel is not homogeneous in any way. It has between 18 and 22% of its population being non-Jewish, the majority of it being Arab Muslim. Some of the Arab Muslims are Bedouins living in the south, some Bedouins living in the north, some non-Bedouin Muslims. All the Bedouins are also Muslims. Furthermore, there are also Christians that are in fact Arabs, and Druze who are neither Muslims nor Christians, but they speak Arabic, being of a different religion. All of the Druze in Israel and some of the Bedouins are serving in the IDF. We have judges who are Arab, we have CEOs of hospitals, many doctors in the country are of Arab origin. You can study in universities, which brings me to the issue of apartheid. I lived in South Africa just after apartheid stopped being legal. There were benches in the parks still having signs on them saying whites only, blacks only, and coloreds only. God forbid that this will ever happen in our country. An Arab citizen of the state of Israel can vote, which blacks could not do under apartheid. Arab citizens can live anywhere they want. It's illegal, in fact, to not allow them to live somewhere that they want, even if some Jews may not like it. And I cannot say that every single Jew loves the Arabs. That would not be true. But legally, they have the right to live anywhere they want, to study at universities, to have equal opportunities. Some people would like to employ Jewish people rather than Arab people. Some prefer to employ Arab people rather than Jewish people. Either way, it's illegal to not employ an Arab because he or she is an Arab, and vice versa. The High Court of Law, the Supreme Court in the state of Israel, is independent and tends to take care of such issues if and when people come and discuss these issues with high courts of law. But there are heads of banks, chair people, senior people in the Israeli society that are also Arab. Is it perfect? No, it's not perfect. There are still things to do. It's important in the messaging to understand that there is complexity within society. And I'll just give you one example. People live in different towns and cities, allowing pluralism. So there are Arab towns, there are Jewish towns, and there are towns that are mixed. Allowing that in the beginning of the establishment of the state of Israel allowed for pluralism. Likewise, Jewish people go to Jewish schools, regular schools. that study in Hebrew. Those are the secular Jews. There are also different schools for the national religious. So if you have a kippah on your head and you are not ultra-Orthodox or secular, you have your own stream of schooling. Why? Not to segregate, but rather to honor your wish to study in a different manner. Likewise with the ultra-Orthodox. If you want a different kind of lifestyle, such as the ultra-Orthodox, you may study in ultra-Orthodox schools. It's a problem and not a problem. On the one hand, it allows for pluralism, different ways of living, studying, understanding things. On the other hand, it creates separate paths of education and living style. Likewise with the Arabs. If you're an Arab, you have the opportunity to study in Arabic schools in your own towns and cities. I'm personally against it, but if I, as a legislator, as a member of Knesset, will today announce in the Knesset, I want everybody to have equal rights. I want everybody to learn in Hebrew, to have equal opportunity to find a job. Most likely, the Arab members of Knesset will pounce on me and tell me that I'm not respecting their culture and their heritage, not allowing them to study separately in their own language, even though my intentions are pure. So it depends. You cannot be perfect. The situation is neither black nor white. It's complex. And this complexity is the everyday life of living in a heterogeneous and also highly sensitive society, such as our country, with its relative challenges and threats in the region as well. So I hope I gave a little peep into what it is to be a manager of a country like Israel. Quite challenging.
Really, thank you so much for the interview. And I want to tell the audience, those who do not know Israel, as you mentioned, as Knesset member Ruth Wasserman Lande, correct, has invited everyone, please come to Israel and see for yourself. The best is always to see for yourself. And I want also to extend to our Jewish brothers and sisters that you should be very proud of yourselves. You are the only indigenous people in the world to ever come back to the same land, to the same territory, to the same language. First time in 2,000 years that no other people has done. We should be inspiration. We are inspiration to all those who are indigenous. And Israel has produced an incredible social, national liberal movement of a nation whereby a nation has retained its identity in real time with a physical state and has provided and does provide tremendous and beautiful rights to all its citizens. And so we take the invitation and we will meet you in Israel.
Inshallah and Bezrat Hashem. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.